Welcome, fight fans, once again to the DAZN MMA show. Sean O'Connell and Dan Hardy, happy to be with you again. Dan, the last time you and I got to speak with one another, there was a very important guest on the program, Francis Ngannou. We got to chat with him about the big contract, the big news he has signed with the PFL. There are a lot of layers to this onion. There's a lot of different things to discuss as it pertains to Francis now being part of the PFL as a company. Obviously, Francis eventually fighting for the PFL. This past week, the reactions to the news have been incredibly interesting to me. And I just wanted to get your first thoughts on sort of the community-wide reaction to Francis signing with the PFL.
Well, I mean, obviously, it's been quite entertaining from one person to the next. It's been quite mixed. You know, there've been some people that have been very complimentary, which was very, very respectful of them and very considered. It was a big move by Francis, and I think everybody recognizes that. And I think the waves that it sent through the community, the MMA community, when it was announced, it shows how big of a move it was, because there was so much trash going into it about, wow, he's made the wrong decision, he's missed his opportunity, he's too difficult to work with. And then the deal comes out, and then all of those opinions then shift. And, people show their true colors, don't they? The good people stand out, and the people that are not so happy about it cannot hide it. Really, really interesting to watch.
Well, one of the most interesting reactions came from a man whose face and voice have defined the opinions of mixed martial arts fans for a couple of decades now. Of course, I'm talking about UFC president Dana White, who was asked about Francis' contract after fight night. Mackenzie Dern, Angela Hill, MMA journalists doing their job for real, and asked Dana White what he thought of the Francis signing with the PFL news. And here's what Dana White had to say.
Based on what I know about the deal, which is not much, it makes no sense to me. I mean, you're going to pay a guy not to fight for a year, and it's already been like 18 months. He's fought 3 times in the last 3 years. It's just not what we do here. It's not what we do. And the day that we released him, I knew exactly what was going to happen. And Francis wants to take 0 risks. Doesn't want to take any chances. And he obviously didn't want to take a chance against Jon Jones. And after we saw what happened with Ciryl Gane, I don't blame him. I think the outcome would have been exactly the same. And I'm sure most of you do, and I'm sure Francis does too. And the media makes it sound like that I'm saying that he's afraid of him. I don't think that he's afraid of anybody. It's just the fact that he doesn't want to take any risk. He wants to, PFL's going to pay this guy to train for a boxing match that may not even happen and that they might not even be involved in. How does that make any sense? It doesn't make sense to me. I mean, Anthony Joshua called it a gimmick fight this week. When asked about that fight, he's like, I'm focused on fighting the best guys in the world. I'm not interested in a gimmick fight right now. And that's one of the big problems with boxing right now, is it's all about these gimmicky type fights. And that's just not what I do here. It's not what I do. I put on fights with the best fighters in the world and fights that people want to see. Francis could have done a deal here. Hunter threw the kitchen sink at that guy, Hunter went to more dinners with Francis Ngannou and did everything in his power to try to get this fight done. And, Francis just thinks that he's in a position where he's got some Conor McGregor-Mayweather fight on his hands, which he does not. That fight was like a once-in-a-lifetime type deal. Fight that I wasn't very interested in. But at the end of the day, it became so big. The right guys, the right time, the right place. The fans wanted it, so we did it, and we got it done. MMA guys versus boxers doesn't make any sense to me. But I know that he thinks there's all this money in it. I disagree. I don't think there is. And I have no beef with the PFL. I mean, these guys have always been super professional and, never talked any smack. You know me. If I don't like you, whether it's De La Hoya or another, organization out there, whatever it is, I don't hold back. I'll let you have it. But, what they're doing makes no sense to me.
So, Dan, obviously, there was a lot to unpack there, right? Dana talked about it a lot. He says he doesn't know much about the deal, but then it seemed like he knew kind of a lot about the deal. What'd you make of what Dana White had to say?
I think it was. I think he tried to be as complimentary as he could about the PFL, which surprised me because generally Dana's quite brash in his choice of words and his approach, but he continues with the same narrative, and we see this throughout the world. It's used over and over again, especially in the 21st century through social media. If you repeat the same thing enough people will start to believe it for it to become a thing. Like saying that I'm not suggesting that he's scared, but he's scared. I'm not suggesting that he doesn't want to fight John Jones, but he definitely doesn't want to fight John Jones. If he fought John Jones, I'm not saying John Jones would beat him, but we all know, and Francis knows, that John Jones would beat him. Like, it's just like, just picture a world, a parallel universe where everything branched off in the opposite direction. Francis Ngannou stayed with the UFC, got a healthy paycheck, and he was happy with what he got. And John Jones decided to go the opposite direction. The story would be entirely the opposite direction, but exactly the same tune. It would be, well, John Jones has gone to the PFL because he's afraid to fight Francis. Like, it's too predictable, and it like. Of course, he wasn't going to have any other kind of reaction. It doesn't surprise me at all. But it's funny to kind of watch it kind of, churn out over like a 5-minute speech where it just kind of ebbs and flows back to the same subject.
Look, Dana's going to do what Dana's going to do. He's the president of the UFC, right? He's going to say what he has to say. He's going to gas up the guys that are still on his roster, in this case, John Jones. He's going to undercut guys that are no longer on his roster, in this case, Francis Ngannou. Anyone in that role would probably be doing something similar. But the way that he chooses to use certain phrases, and this point has been made across the community, but Francis doesn't want to take risks. It's like the silliest thing that anyone can say. I mean, never mind Francis's origin story in the sport of mixed martial arts, which was a literal, like, life-threatening risk-taking over and over and over again, trying to get from Africa to Europe to have the opportunity that eventually led him to being the best heavyweight fighter in the world. But just doing this, just exploring true free agency, was Francis embracing risk in a way that no other fighter has to this level, right? So it's you can't say that. I mean, it's fine if you want to say he made the wrong move. Like, I would expect Dana to say that. But you cannot reasonably say Francis Ngannou doesn't want to take risks. He bet on himself in the biggest way possible. He took a massive risk with his future, his career, his reputation, and it cashed for him. This is what every mixed martial arts fighter wishes they could do. People wish they had this kind of leverage. Francis used it, and here's where we're at. It's going to be fascinating to see what happens. It's going to be incredible to see the opponent that signs up to fight Francis in the PFL super fight division. It's going to be very interesting to see the way that this could potentially change the way free agency is approached in the future for not just Francis, not just champions, but people who are contenders, people who are on the rise. I mean, it's an inflection point in our sport, Dan, that people have been waiting for a long time. Is it going to change things dramatically? Is it going to fix pay structure in mixed martial arts? I'm not here to say that, but it's an important moment. And of course, the UFC's boss is telling you that it's not.
Of course. I mean, of course, Dana has a job to do. He has to spin it in the UFC's direction always. And he's done such a good job of it, which is why, the UFC story is the one that prevails almost always, and why the UFC is such a powerhouse in mixed martial arts. But it certainly opens things up a great deal. And he has to be aware of that. Like, I think, to me, honestly, the biggest game changer is guaranteeing a purse of $2 million for his opponent. Because that
Absolutely
immediately means that everybody's going to reconsider. They're going to go, hang on, 12-12, 20-20. Like, where am I starting at with the UFC as a like, say you're a 5-0, 8-0 heavyweight, something like that. Are you looking at deals on the table? Like, do you take the risk? I think a lot of heavyweights would. And you'll know better than me, but in my history in mixed martial arts of training, heavyweights have generally, there have been a lot more prize fighter mentality in heavyweights. I think because there are a lot of guys that just happen to be really big and they realize if they can get a few fighting skills, they'll make a bit of money. Does that make sense? I think there's much more of a prize fighting mindset within heavyweight mixed martial arts compared to the rest of the divisions, and I think that plays into Francis's favor because he's put a big purse on the table. He's basically said, "Come and get it." And I mean, well, I was looking at heavyweights across Europe recently for next year's divisions, depending on if we choose that one, and we are stacked. There are loads of heavyweights, and the feedback is, I've got someone for Francis. I've got someone that'll fight him. He's 14-4-1, but he'll fight anybody. And there are a lot of heavyweights putting their hands up, and someone will be qualified enough to step in there.
One of the other interesting things here, we got a chance to talk to Francis before the announcement went public, right? And kind of seeing the way that he was anticipating how it was going to be handled. I have a ton of admiration for Francis because he was aloof to it, right? He's above it all. He knows that he signed this deal. He's happy with what's going on. It's disappointing to see the way that a lot of the so-called MMA fans have reacted. If your reaction to this is that Francis did something wrong, you're not an MMA fan, you're a UFC fan. And that's fine, but just don't confuse one with the other.
That's a good point.
The way that big-time fighters that are currently on the UFC roster reacted to this, or guys like Daniel Cormier, who's like the face and voice in a lot of ways of the UFC, the way that Israel Adesanya and Conor McGregor and Daniel Cormier have acknowledged how huge this moment is for Francis, for the PFL, and for the sport of mixed martial arts, tells you all you need to know. These are people who are deeply embedded in the sport, people whose future and paycheck and well-being is closely tied with the UFC. And thankfully, they all have the sort of clout and the leverage and the positioning in the sport to tell the truth and say, this is huge. This is a big one.
I was really impressed with, especially with Cormier. He always has a very level opinion. It always seems to come at it from a very kind of mature wrestling coach kind of way. You know what I mean? Like, this is very objective. These are the positives. And I think he's right. And Adesanya recognized it as well, that the fact that it does change things. The only thing that disappointed me is that Adesanya is one of those fighters that's got that kind of power as well. And I feel like, the movement towards better pay across the board, standing up for your opponent's paychecks as well as your own, that could have resonated a lot more if it was more than one person saying it. And Adesanya is one of those people that could make that big change as well. But it's Francis that took the opportunity to try and make the change on his own. I'm just very impressed with Cormier's response, to be honest. And I think the world recognizes, the MMA world recognizes that it's really opened up heavyweight mixed martial arts. It's put a big purse on the table, and there's a lot of people that are going to try and get their hands on it.
For people who aren't familiar, maybe are just combat sports fans and aren't really familiar with the way that a lot of professional leagues do their business and have collective bargaining agreements, right? The big stars in those leagues are part of a union that ensures that the lowest man on the roster, right, on their team and on the opposing teams, like their lowliest opponent, gets a certain guaranteed minimum pay. Collective bargaining is probably never going to be a reality in the sport of mixed martial arts. But Francis Ngannou, in this contract, went out of his way to do something that looks a little bit like collective bargaining. Said, you're going to pay me whatever it is, $5 million, $10 million, but I'm not going to go in there against the guy who's making $100,000. I refuse to do that. You're going to pay that person, and he told us $2 million minimum. Look at all the top heavyweights in the world right now, Dan Hardy. There's a big long list, and tell me which of them are making $2 million per fight.
Very, very, very few. I would even go as far as to say there are some in other sports, maybe kickboxing or boxing, that might be looking at mixed martial arts thinking, $2 million is a lot of money. I might consider stepping over.
Yeah, I've seen Rico Verhoeven's name thrown out there. Look, John Jones makes $2 million plus per fight from the UFC. He doesn't need to go anywhere. I think Stipe's on that level. right? Stipe Miocic is going to get that kind of money from the UFC. Look at the UFC's top 10. Nobody else is making that money. Nobody else is making that money to fight John Jones, who holds the belt right now. Nobody else is making that money to fight Stipe, if Stipe is able to beat John Jones or whatever. Nobody else is making that kind of money. If you're Pavlovich, Spivak, Aspinall, if you're all of these people who are on the rise, you're looking at your contract and you're doing one of two things. You're saying, I need to get out of this and go fight Francis for $2 million. Or you're saying, Dana White, Hunter Campbell, if they can pay that kind of money, you can too. And I want it. And that is what changes things in mixed martial arts. Francis started this. Let's see what happens. Snowball effect.